New standard here. Recordings in progress. You're on.
Tonight, and just all of those that are joining online tonight, for those online, at the end of Alia's talk, if you will put your questions in the chat box, and then we can answer them from there. Before we get to Alia's talk, I have a few announcements. Excuse me. Monday, February 21st at 6:30 p.m. is the PAHS book discussion group. That's always via Zoom, and we'll be discussing the book, The Pueblo Revolt, by David, Pueblo Revolt, Secret Rebellion that drove the Spaniards out of the Southwest, by David Wallace. A little bit about the book. With the conquest of New Mexico in 1598, Spanish government, soldiers, and missionaries began their brutal subjugation of Pueblo Indians. This oppression continued for decades until in the summer of 1680, led by a visionary shaman named Revolt, and read all about the revolt, join the book discussion group, and learn and express your opinions on the book. You have plenty of time to get the book, read it, and join our book discussion groups. Again, February 21st, 6:30.
And 24, and
February
oh, we're doing two.
February 20. 24.
Well, I'm glad to see you guys are as organized as I am.
None of the states and the world was, to quote a 1956 Life magazine article, put into a hypnotism by an event that happened right here in Pueblo, Colorado. It goes online. Books were written, movies were made, and social events were celebrated at this event. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Brian Murphy became a rage. Pueblo businessman Laurie Bernstein became interested in hypnotism, hypnotized the local. While under hypnosis, told how she had grown up in the early 19th century in Ireland as Brian Murphy, and so became an event that put Pueblo in the spotlight. Revisit this event and join us February 26th, for a special program at the Ethos at 615 East Mesa. The speaker will be Bryce Pettit, who has been researching this phenomenon, and we'll talk about these events and some new factual data to cover things that no one on either side of the Brian-Murphy debate considered. For information, contact myself or Thomas me back there. Help us put that together. He's memorized it. And for more details, and we will be sending out an email on that too soon. Thursday, March 6th, right here in the Heritage Room, our next speaker program will be, our guest speaker will be Chris Johnston, and he's the Senior Project Archaeologist and Operations Director for Paleocultural Research Group. His program will be on the recent archaeological research conducted on the Chancellor Ranch. For those not familiar with the Chancellor Ranch is a 53,000 acre working cattle ranch managed by the Colorado State Land Board in Los Angeles County. The property borders the Purgatory River and the Finney Canyon maneuver site. In 2022, the Paleocultural Research Group staff and volunteers conducted a reconnaissance inventory of the property with funding from the Colorado State Historical Fund and the Colorado State Land Board. Very little archaeological work had ever been conducted on the property prior to this inventory. PCRG, or the Paleo Research Group, focused mainly on high probability areas, specifically near canyon heads and along canyon rims, to assess the cultural resources on the property. The results were astounding, with PCRG documenting 41 archaeological resource sites. So mark your calendars, March 6th. Chris Johnson will be here and, to tell us about these archaeological findings. Okay, take yourself back. August 10th, 30 BC, 2054 years ago, this month, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, was one of the most famous people in world history. Committed suicide in Alexandria, according to legend, by holding a poisonous snake to her. Her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. In her time, the richest and most powerful woman in the world, charming and undeniably intelligent, but with a notable streak of cruelty, she was involved in pivotal events in world history, and she is still a woman discussed and vigorously debated. Join us April 3rd for our regular meeting, Thursday, April 3rd, to hear Cleopatra, the Last Pharaoh, our enduring fascination with her. Our guest speaker will be Dennis Piccolo from the Denver Egyptian Studies Society. Dennis will cover Cleopatra's life, her personality, as far as we can know it, and her continuing impact on modern culture. This program will be a real change of pace, and I'm excited to hear this talk. So mark your calendar for that. Everything will be in the midden, so you can get the information there also.
Will Elizabeth Taylor arrive?
She's gonna make a ghostly visit.
It's more. Okay, imagine that. Roll this next calendar. Catherine, did we decide to do the Cleopatra book for our?
Yeah, we haven't set a date yet.
Okay. So, I just wanted to mention, as an added bonus to this talk, our next book discussion group will be a book, about Cleopatra called Cleopatra, A Life, by Stacy Schiff. And that'll be in the next and also with a date. I'm halfway through the book now, and it's pretty fascinating and a captivating, time in history. I would now like to introduce our guest speaker, Alia Wallace. Alia is an archaeologist in Bureau of Land Management, Royal Gorge Field Office. She has previously worked for both the National Park Service and the Forest Service. However, most of her experience comes from working internationally in Italy, Bulgaria, and the UK, where she completed her MA at the University of York and her PhD at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London. Her experience and interests are in sustainable heritage management approaches, with particular interest in the presentation and interpretation of cultural resources, and how this can be used as a tool for conservation of heritage sites. Excuse me, of heritage sites around the world and here in Colorado. Please welcome Alia.
Who's gonna, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, we have a quick costume change.
I'm paranoid. What would you say?
He thinks I have pet lice.
You never know. Okay. Oh my.
Is that okay?
Yeah, can people online hear me okay? Okay, cool. Hey, sorry, this is weird. This is gonna take me a minute to get used to. Yeah, so I'm Alia Wallace, archaeologist, currently, with the Bureau of Land Management. Yeah, sorry, now I feel like I'm in the spotlight. I work, yeah, archaeologist at the Royal Gorge Field Office with the Bureau of Land Management. I've been at that position for about 4 years. Before that, I worked briefly with the Park Service up in Minnesota. It was too cold up there for me. Very, very cold. And then before that, worked in the Forest Service in California. And before that is where we're going to talk about. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be kind of based. Uh-oh, I did it wrong. There we go. Forgot, but this is my short little agenda. A lot of what I'm going to talk about comes out of my PhD research and things when I was working overseas. It's got a heavy emphasis in European kind of theory and viewpoints, just because that's where my experience was. I came into Colorado having, for this position, I had 0 Colorado archaeology experience, so I'm still pretty new to that. But I am going to tie it into kind of how I use what I learned and worked on throughout my PhD and my master's in my current position. Because while my research was all international, the themes and kind of the work that comes from it can be applied to any sort of like heritage management. So that was my brief intro. I'm going to go through a kind of brief history of conservation management. Again, very brief. People have written millions of books on these, like very big ones. And it's going to be kind of focusing a lot more on Italy, which is so my PhD research was at Pompeii and Herculaneum, the Vesuvian sites. So looking at that kind of background. And then I'm going to talk a bit about where we're kind of at with heritage management and conservation management today, and kind of the themes of, the trends that are moving forward, and how that I'm working on that kind of stuff in my current position. Let's see if I can figure this out. There we go. So couple just quick, oh my God, my brain, I'm sorry guys, my brain just like fell right out there. Definitions, that's the word I'm looking for. It's been a long couple of weeks. So conservation management, site management, heritage management, cultural resource management, you'll hear they're kind of interchangeable. The idea is, we're coming together to manage these resources. I'll probably refer to them in a couple different ways throughout this. I just wanted to put that up there. The goal of them is to manage, what it is that's important about these cultural resources. I called it site management throughout most of my PhD. Now it's, cultural resource management tends to be like contract archaeology in a lot of ways, heritage management. So these words are kind of interchangeable. Conservation is just kind of, again, a lot of times you'll hear conservation and preservation kind of interchanged. In general, conservation is, stabilizing a site as it is, in repairing or, trying to bring it back to keeping it from, bringing it kind of back more to its, I don't want to say original, but, enhancing it some, whereas preservation is just trying to prevent that future decay. Again, you'll hear these words used interchangeably depending on where you're working. In the grand scheme of things for this talk, it's not the biggest deal. I just wanted to throw them out there so that there's kind of a definition for them. So, hold on one second. I'm going to move. Oh, I don't know how to do that. That's okay. We'll figure it out. So the idea of conservation is not new. It's been around since the early days of, ancient Rome. Pliny the Elder writes about kind of restoring artwork and antiquities. Ironically, he's also the one who died at Pompeii, and is also the one who documented all of that. So, full circle there. There's also evidence of repairs to statues and architecture and artwork during that time. But the emphasis was on restoring the function or aesthetic appearance and minimizing damage to kind of promote the longevity. Hold on, I'm going to have to push a button because it's in my way, and I hope I don't break it. Okay. Along with that, in Pompeii, there's evidence of frescoes and architecture that were being repaired at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius. They had an earthquake in 62 AD, and there's evidence of artworks being repaired at the time of the eruption that they've been able to find, which is pretty cool. It showed that, at that time people cared about this. It wasn't just, they cared about the art in the same way we would. During kind of the Middle Ages, attitudes towards the classical and ancient works kind of changed to make it more utilitarian and recycling things. There wasn't actually as much of an emphasis on keeping them preserved or conserving them. It was like, oh, cool, we have some marble here, let's turn it into something new. And if you think about what was going on in the world at that time, it makes sense. They didn't have that luxury of kind of just having, excess stuff around. It was a survival. During the Renaissance, this is kind of where we start to see, sorry, I need to just move this little thing out of the way. There we go. It was like right over the notes. During the Renaissance, we start seeing where they were finding, classical sites, and then that led to a trend to kind of want to embellish on them and kind of make that, connecting back to that ancient time. The goal was to kind of respect it, but also to reconstruct it. Where it would have the original kind of appearance of it, but they would, fill in the areas that were missing. Um, and there's a quote up there and talking about how, the antiquities were restored in a way to give them more grace as compared to, say a Greek statue that has no head or arms. They wanted to complete that and put it all together. This is also kind of one of the first times we see written information on how restorations were done with techniques and materials. I believe it came out of Italy. I should have probably written that down. It wasn't very in depth. It was like, one or two sentences just talking about that. We don't get the full idea of how they did it, but it shows again that there's an awareness at that time and that there was an interest in how restoration was done, and the different techniques. So moving forward a little bit through the Enlightenment, there was a shift in kind of how the world viewed everything, the Enlightenment. And it was a shift that society and the world could be understood by mankind, and it wasn't that everything was a reflection of God. There was more of this understanding that humans could do things, and it wasn't all being controlled by a higher being. Antiquities were seen as kind of more original documents that needed to be studied and appreciated so we could learn from them. There, sorry. Also, during this time, we start to see, especially with the Grand Tour, you see people traveling a lot more. You've got people moving around from different places to learn. It tends to be upper class, like men, but women got to do it a bit later on. So it's still pretty limited to the fact that, this is, upper echelons of society. But at least you're getting kind of international viewpoints and people working together and thinking on a broader scale. During this time, there's kind of two primary lines of conservation thought that emerge. The idea of preserving remains as they are and keeping them as ruins, and then what's considered it's restoration, and then it's also considered called stylistic authenticity. And this emerged out of France in the idea that authenticity was in the style and how things were done. So the style of an object or the methods and not in the material, which was a big change because before a lot of it had to do with more of the material. But on the other side, there were others that argued that we could never replicate original works, so why do that? But this really is when we start to see that big kind of a lot of different theories of conservation coming up and different thought processes on how do we conserve these things? How do we preserve them? Do we preserve them or do we just reuse them? And a lot of debates across the world, or primarily in Europe at least. And then also we see along with this is kind of the beginnings, and the Grand Tour had a lot to do with this, but then it expanded the origins of cultural tourism, which is where we start seeing archaeological sites used to kind of inform and educate people. Before they were, again, very limited to certain audiences, and they still remain that way, but they were open to much wider audiences than they had been before. So Pompeii and Herculaneum, I'm kind of using them as a little bit of a case study here. Talk about a little bit about the history of how these were kind of first excavated and the management. Again, people have written very large books on this. I wrote a 100,000-word thesis on it. So if anybody is really interested, I can get you references. I'm not going to go super into depth just because there's not the time for it. But one of the great things with Pompeii and Herculaneum is because they've been involved in this process of conservation management and tourism since 1738, we see that evolution of conservation management in theory and how that works in different places. Again, it's Italy. It's, a very Western viewpoint. Conservation management has evolved differently in the East. And Italy's a little unique in some ways, but it's a great place to be able to trace kind of the evolution of this kind of management and how it's changed in the different influences, which is why I chose it as a case study for my PhD. So one of the first things is with this, we also have a way to see how the actions at archaeological sites with their management at Pompeii and Herculaneum are kind of driven by specific people. In this case, it was King Charles of Bourbon. I think he was Napoleon's cousin or brother. I can't remember exactly. And the first excavations began in 1738. They were instigated by the new king who had been made the king of that area. At this time, Italy was not a unified country. So it was a bunch of little kingdoms all around. And he wanted to use Herculaneum to start. The Herculaneum actually was just rediscovered before Pompeii. He wanted to use that to kind of prove the legitimacy of his kingdom, that this is his kingdom and this is the stuff that we're getting from it. And it shows, that his kingdom was, even though he was just assigned king that week or whatever, but that's how it was done. Early excavations at Herculaneum were very not at all what we would think about today. They were done by engineers. They were very unscientific, very destructive, as you can see by the hole in the wall. This down here is actually one of my favorite quotes. It was about one of the guys who was in charge of the excavations in this time. And one of the guys had actually said that he had as little to do with antiquities as the moon has to do with crayfish. Just to show, but that's the thing. It was done by manual laborers, and the idea was to collect items that were important or pretty or special and take them to the museum, and they became part of the king's collection. Other things were destroyed to go on so they wouldn't end up on the black market. And I will say it's kind of ironic at this point. A lot of those things that were taken and put in the museum have actually fared better than things that were left on the sites or in the sites because of the exposure to the elements. So frescoes and things that were removed at that time have actually fared a bit better now because they've been protected. But with the excavations here at Herculaneum, so the way Herculaneum was buried was slightly different than Pompeii. It's very deep deposits, and they were having to tunnel down. And that's what these tunnels are for. And they're all underground. If you were to visit Herculaneum today, the archaeology site is say here. Apologies, people online. You can't see my hands. Here, and the modern town is up here. We're talking 30 meters of the pyroclastic material. So the excavations were going very deep in, and it was basically super dark and kind of, as it's early descriptions of the excavations were that it was dark and miserable. And that's how people viewed the site. It's kind of cool to think about now. I kind of wish I could have seen it that way now that it's all been exposed. But it wasn't a very nice place to visit. People would have to walk around with little lanterns, and it just doesn't give you felt like you're more in a cave than in an archaeology site. So with that, there got to be a lot of criticism about the kingdom and how, Herculaneum just wasn't that great. It brought people and they were like, this is cool, but we don't really like it that much. Because of that and this kind of negative viewpoint of that, about 10 years after that, excavation shifted to Pompeii. Pompeii was a completely different situation. in the sense that it was a very low coverage of what was actually buried. And then there was actually the tops of the buildings were like either sticking out or had already been gone. So it was much easier to excavate. You can see up in that photo on the left there, that one I believe was from like 18 something. I'd have to look at the actual thing. But that was what it was looking like as it was coming out. So it's these ruined half walls that are, parts of them had already been missing because of the eruption and how things were. Plus, there's entire towns and stuff built on top of them. But it opened it up, so it's more like a museum, like an open museum that you can walk around in. And as they're excavating these areas, people are seeing all of it. Obviously, there's a lot of material there. But it made it an open air museum, like, where you felt like you were almost walking around a town, which you are. However, at that time, let me check something real quick. So with that, because people were more interested in that, the king enacted a policy that would leave these excavated buildings unburied, and it also left more frescoes and mosaics left in situ, so in the place. I will tell you 100%, a lot of those are not doing so well these days. But that was to give people that feeling of being able to, when you walked into a house, you could see the original fresco that was there and the artwork. However, that obviously means that there's a lot more challenges with the conservation, a lot more work that needs to be done, a lot more money. And I don't know if you guys remember, but back in about 2010, I think, there was a building that collapsed at Pompeii. It became like international news. It was this huge, huge thing. That was about 1 month after I started my PhD. So that was fun. And everybody's like, oh, this is a huge thing. The first record of a building collapse is from like the 1700s. It's been going on there for hundreds of years. It's because the way that these buildings are coming out, like they have to be stabilized in order to stay. Also, it's a lot of stuff. Like it's a huge area. But that these conservation issues that they've had have been there since the beginning. It's not a new thing. So when you hear about it in the news, because for a few years you'll hear something about how Italy's not able to care for their heritage sites and things. Understand that it's been going on since the 1700s. Like it's not at all a new thing there. One of the other things is once they were starting to excavate things, they also started to reconstruct things. So the photo here on the right is the same building that is on the left. You can see in the photo on the left, there's no roofs. One of the big differences between Pompeii and Herculaneum, the material was deep enough that a lot of the second floors are intact. At Pompeii, all of the second floors were pretty much wiped out, just with the eruption and everything. So a lot of people, when you're walking around Pompeii, it doesn't look like there's upper floors of buildings. But that's just because of how it was. But a lot of buildings started to be restored in this very stylistic way. The restoration and how they did them was based off of like ancient texts and kind of this very elaborate thing. It wasn't necessarily based off of the evidence. At the time, archaeology still wasn't really a thing. It was starting to kind of peak out as a field. But in general, this was, again, they wanted to create an experience for the visitors. They wanted to create a place that people could come and learn about this stuff. And it didn't always 100% matter if it was correct or truthful. It was what people were interested in. And that's something we see still. So these are, again, kind of photos of the same thing. The one on the left is an older one. Again, I think it was like 1800s. I should have written down the dates. I do apologize for that. The one on the right is when I was working there a few years ago. Same place. obviously you can see there's been a lot of changes to it. So during this time of for Pompeii and everything, and I will say, I'm going to kind of group the 1700s and 1800s, all that together. There was a lot of changes at the site. Towards the end of 1800s, we start to see a lot more scientific methods. That's where the plaster casts are introduced. Um, and all that. But again, there's just a lot of material to cover with all of that. So when people go to visit the site today, they're seeing these more complete images. And they're not aware that, when a lot of these structures were first excavated, they were maybe like 3 meters maximum. Like depending, that's I think kind of the deepest areas. Some parts in Pompeii are very shallow just based off of the topography. So the actual material that was covering it, there's very little remains from it. But part of that, because of the way that these things were coming out, it led to a lot of different methods for restoration. So the introduction of putting roofs on areas to protect them, especially like frescoes, to keep like water from pouring onto the frescoes. I will say it's kind of funny because in the early days, even then they noticed, the frescoes would fade. And in order to, I mean, funny in kind of a sad way, but in order to refresh them, they would throw water on them to get the colors brighter. Yeah. And what part of my research that I was looking at like guidebooks and things like that. And actually one of the guidebooks from like early 2000s recommended that as well. So it's something that people like, I don't know why, like it's a very big, don't do that if you're around an ancient fresco, please. But different things to protect and stabilize the ruins as they come out. The introduction of metal reinforcements, using modern materials to reconstruct it to keep it standing. That kind of stuff. We start to see a lot of that during this time. We know it was done at some places because we have photos. But the full extent of it, we just don't have the records from early on to be able to say how the full extent. I mean, I don't think we would ever know how much reconstruction has been done at that site just because of the fact that it's been done so much for such a long time. But I will say towards the end of the 19th century is when we start to see kind of those reconstructions being based on the evidence that are at the site, as opposed to just kind of these idealized artistic renditions. There are some that still to this day, current scholars would say are done incorrectly. I would argue that that's now part of the history of the site, and it's something that we can learn from and interpret and educate people about. Is that's another life cycle of this site. Is it was a site before, like the city when it beforehand, it became an archaeology site, and then it almost became like a laboratory for this conservation work throughout the years. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Well, not really. It's still kind of the same time. So, I mean, it was all back in the day. So in the 1861, Italy unified into one country. So again, we start to see the sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum. I mean, they've never really disappeared from the kind of knowledge, like people, it never really went out of fashion, but it becomes more in fashion again. And that's because Italy starts to claim their own heritage. As I had mentioned, prior to that time, Italy was a bunch of little kingdoms. When they unified, this was like, this is our stuff, and this is, we're going to claim it. So a lot of money went into it. They also wanted to get past just being considered an antiquarian, like hunting ground, which it was and still was at this time. I mean, technically it still kind of is today. There's a lot of looting and illegal, like illicit, looting that goes on at these sites. But at that time, they really claimed it as their own. We see the scientific, actual archaeologists, and I say that in quotes because the archaeologists of the late 1800s aren't really what we would consider the same as archaeologists today. Slightly different like standards for it, but archaeologists were actually working at the site. It wasn't engineers just going through with pickaxes. But we're also seeing that there's a lot of urban growth and development. At the site of Pompeii, the actual archaeological site is surrounded by the modern town of Pompeii. And there's actually houses built on top of the areas that are unexcavated. And you've got this very dense urban archaeology interface. I mean, you're just walking down a modern city, and then there's the entrance to the Roman site. So it's kind of cool. But you've got this huge, kind of urban growth. But we also start to see a lot more of, so there's a lot more just internationally, we see more destruction of archaeological sites. Intentional, unfortunately, but also unintentional. Development, tourism, looting is a big thing. Excavations are probably one of the most destructive things we could ever do to an archaeology site, but we still do it. And sometimes we don't do them as much, thankfully. But that's another thing that did but also World War I, World War II. There's actually a bomb in World War II that was dropped on Pompeii. And there's you can actually see where it was, and when they were doing some excavations in that area, they were able to find some of the fragments because they thought the Nazis were hiding there, or the fascists or somebody. I don't know. But yeah, it dropped right outside of the Roman walls. At this time, we also have a lot more kind of the abuse of archaeology for for kind of nationalist reasons. We saw it with the Nazis with prehistoric archaeology. In Italy, it's Mussolini. And I will say, one of the great things about it is he put a lot of money towards these places, a lot of money. Unfortunately, it wasn't used in the best way. So under fascism with Mussolini, there was an emphasis on this classical past. So Pompeii and Herculaneum received a lot of money, a lot of work. They had crews of 600 workers just clearing the site, excavating at a time. It was just I think I read somewhere that they were able to basically they would excavate a house, and then within 2 years it was ready to be presented to the public. And that went on for a while. So they got a lot of stuff done. This is when we start to see at Herculaneum, they start doing a lot more large scale excavations to where you can actually towns exposed as opposed to going through tunnels. Unfortunately, other places, so in Rome, for example, Mussolini had ordered the kind of basic destruction of anything that was not Roman to clear out for the Roman sites. So this kind of gave us, we got the isolation of cultural heritage from its surrounding. So in Rome, you've got the Colosseum, you've got some of these other sites, and they've been kind of almost cleared out so that they're centralized. Pompeii and Herculaneum, it's a little different because they're big towns, but they were still the focus and things were cleared away from them. They were used similar to how it was under, the unification of Italy and under the Bourbon King, that these were their way of kind of celebrating the greatness of the fascist regime and that kind of thing. So the public image of the sites was very important. They did have, at this time, the superintendent of the sites. He was actually one of the longer ones. And he actually was really he was an archaeologist by training, which was again unique. I think he was one of the first ones. And he had been in that position for a while. So he was able to continually do work. And his one of the things that he realized was the importance of the visitor experience and creating a story for the visitor. So, there was, he would get a house ready to go up and put the artifacts back in. So you'd walk into the house, you could see where things should have been, beds and furniture, like obviously reconstructions, because a lot of those didn't make it. In general, a lot of his stuff was used where it was found, but he was also known to kind of embellish and, move things around a bit. Up in this photo, up in the top right, so that's the triangular forum in Pompeii. At the time when it was excavated and everything, there's no trees. So those trees were planted during this time in order to create a comfort for the visitor. So there's a lot of changes to how the site is again presented today. You walk into this area when you're visiting the site, it is one of the nicest areas because it's the only place with shade. But that's again not an authentic experience as to what the ancient site would have been. That is something coming out of like 1950s-ish. After the end of fascism, money ran out. Italy did a couple years where they basically, as kind of rebuilding, they created jobs at Pompeii and Herculaneum, but it wasn't anywhere near we aren't talking about hundreds of workers. And when the money ran out, it ran out. Since then, Italy has kind of struggled with the sites. There's a lot to kind of maintain, and we kind of see where they're at today. So these are just a couple photos that came out of my research. But one of the big things is Pompeii itself is a huge area, and so much of it's been exposed at this time that there's now this question on like, how do we maintain this? How do we keep conserving this? Or do we? Like, is it necessary to preserve everything? It's also one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. So it's there's a lot of people there. There's a lot of big groups. And it has its impacts on the site. It's also one of the most economically disadvantaged areas. The Bay of Naples is incredibly poor. Most of their income does come from tourism, but it's very limited, like in the sense that it's not a long stay. A lot of the visitors come and just stay at the site or come and visit the site for a day. So you're not getting that tourism of people staying in the community for a while. You're getting day trippers who are coming in. So this is kind of where the site is today. And it's still a challenge. I will be 100% honest. I have not been back in a few years, but it's something from talking with friends and everything, I've heard they've gotten a bit better with it, but it's a struggle and they're never going to not have that struggle. I know anytime I hear that they've excavated something new, I just am like, no, there's so much there already. But that's part of why this site's so interesting is because you're looking at how do you balance this? Like, how do you make decisions to say, we're going to have to let that area decay so that we can do this? Like, how is that done? And that brings me to the next part of my talk. So in the late 20th century, there's been a kind of, as I mentioned, this need to kind of understand what we're conserving and for who and why. It's not just Italy, it's everywhere's kind of thought about this. But, mass tourism, we have much more diverse audiences traveling around. We've got people from all sorts of international cultures, education levels, interests. People have interests in different themes. It used to be that you would go to a site like Pompeii and learn about like the ancient Romans. People want to know about conservation. People want to know about the daily life of, the not rich people. There's a lot more that people are interested, just because people in general tend to be more educated and well-traveled now. I mean, we've got that luxury. Even I remember even, back when I was a kid, the amount that it costs to fly on an airplane compared to, well, maybe not now. Right now it's a bit expensive. But it's travel's opened up quite a bit. There's also kind of more of a critical eye as to how sites are managed and how that reflects to people. If you're a tourist visiting a World Heritage site, from what you hear about World Heritage, you expect it to be very well maintained, and you're going and finding things like this. People are often disappointed. They get these images in their head that this is going to be the greatest place ever, and you get there and they're like, oh. I'll say, I had that when I went to Egypt. I was like, oh, the Great Pyramids, there's the one Great Pyramid and then the others. I got there and I was like, they're literally all the same size. Like I think, and I looked it up, and it's something like only like a couple meters different. So when you're standing by them, you're like, they're all the same. Like I expected there to be one giant one, and then these little baby ones. Nope. So, you've got that because we have the internet. We've got more books and things. People are more well read, and you have TV shows that have these awesome shots where the pyramid looks giant next to the other ones, and they're all the same. I was very disappointed at the pyramids, I'll be honest. It was cool, but it wasn't the coolest. So what this has kind of done is, created this conversation of how do we make sure we're balancing the values and the significance of the different stakeholders. So I've got these definitions up here. These are very much, you'll hear them if you read anything academic about site management, but the idea is that stakeholders are going to be any of the individuals or groups that are interested or hold value in a place. Some of them are pretty obvious, tourists, we've got academics, local community. Here in Colorado, I don't want to say, so I wouldn't consider the tribes to be they're not common like stakeholders, they're their own sovereign governments and stuff. So it's a little different. We don't call them stakeholders in the same way we would call like a local historical society a stakeholder, but they are a stakeholder. It's just they have a slightly different level of engagement and stuff just based off of the laws and everything. But stakeholders can also be somebody who, looking at the sites in southern Italy, there was a time there where I'm pretty sure the mafia owned a lot of the site and was running a lot of the stuff. So some are valid, some are not valid. Values, historically, the values attributed to archaeology were going to be those historical and artistic. These are things that we're preserving them because they're old or they're pretty. However, now we've got social, economic, educational, religious values, all these different things that we have to kind of think about with managing these. Again, these things aren't just being provided or presented to one audience. We've got a very diverse audience. And then in general, significance is kind of the values make up the significance, and that's why it's important. And we kind of use that with the National Historic Preservation Act. In order for a site to be eligible on the National Historic Preservation Act, it has to meet a certain criteria of significance. And to meet that criteria of significance, it has to hold certain values. We also call it integrity. So a lot of these words are, kind of interchangeable, but these are what it is that are making up why a site is important. And then the stakeholders are kind of the who and why. So with this, we have seen, sorry, I'm just double checking my notes to make sure I haven't missed anything super cool. No, well, maybe it's okay. Oh. So within the past 50-ish, I said that because I was like 50 years ago, actually isn't that long ago anymore. I was like, when did this actually start thinking about it? It's kind of scary. Is this idea of what we're calling values-based management. This really has been frontiered kind of by the Getty Conservation Institute. However, I would argue that the values have always played a role in how a site is managed. Um, it might not necessarily have been the values that we consider valuable, but when Mussolini was putting all that money towards it, there was a value that was ascribed to that site. Um, Often in what we consider conventional is kind of the, non-values based conservation, is that in the conventional ones, we're considering the values of the decision makers. So who owns a site or who's running it? So usually it's a government. Whereas under this, we're looking at all the stakeholders and trying to understand the values across that board. I put this kind of a diagram. I mean, this was something I had created when I was doing my research, but it shows, there's different steps to it where you're looking at, who are the stakeholders? What are we trying to achieve? And then going into, okay, what is the significance in the values? And then how are we going to manage things? So it's kind of more of a process. Key thing I want to point out with that is it is not a static process. When you get to the bottom, it doesn't end. This is something that needs to be continually redone, not necessarily annually. I mean, most management plans will have they'll have a timeline on it. It'll say like management plan for, the next 20 years or 15 years or something. But as things change in society and interest, or if there's something else, it's recommended to keep re-looking at this. So it is a process that goes around. But the idea with this is that if we're looking at all of the different stakeholder values and we're trying to kind of balance them, then we're not prioritizing any one value over the other. And hopefully we're going to be coming up with a more sustainable way of managing things. This does also mean that sometimes, some values still will be treated slightly higher than others. Depending on the laws of the land where you're at, protection might be above education value. But it's if we're not just looking at it as opening it for tourism or keeping it locked off from people because we don't want people to know the site exists, we're able to kind of balance it a bit more. And it brings kind of these stakeholders in throughout the planning process so that we're able to understand more about the values. I would say we don't call it this, but this is what we try to do with the tribes. With working at BLM, we have, if a proposed project comes up and we've got, say, a recreation group that really wants to put in a trail somewhere, we've technically by law, we're required to consult with tribes. But I mean, I hate to say we're just doing that because of the law. We're doing that because we want to understand their values and concerns and significance of that area and any sites that are there and integrate that into our planning process so that we're not adversely impacting anything of significance to the tribes. Same thing we would do with other stakeholders. It's a little bit different with a land management type thing because we're not actively managing archaeological sites in the way, at least at this field office, that we would be doing at like Pompeii. Like if you go down to like canyons at the Ancients at the Tres Rios field office, they've got more of those kinds of problems. Here, we're more protecting them. Like most of our sites are not open to the public. Most people would not know where these archaeological sites are. I go back and forth on that. I see benefit of educating people, but it also by law, like we're not supposed to be just telling people where everything is. But part of how we're approaching that is through engaging the stakeholders in our planning process. And there's certain laws that we have to follow to do that. But the idea is we're engaging them, and hopefully that means that the decisions we're making as an agency will be more sustainable to these resources in the long run. A couple other, whoa, uh-oh, there it is. A couple other themes that came out, especially in this kind of latter half or the late 20th century, the idea of intangible heritage, that it's, the knowledge, skills, practices of a community. This is again big with the tribes, in terms of indigenous plants and indigenous knowledge, that kind of stuff. But you see it internationally, and it doesn't have to, like, we see it a lot in the US for kind of like when we say for like traditional cultural properties is what it would be called under the National Historic like Preservation Act, but it doesn't have to be a tribal thing. It's, it could be a religious thing or a community and that kind of stuff. So, and it's more of that idea of these are traditions that are important. And there is actually intangible heritage, world heritage now, which is pretty cool. So on the World Heritage list, you have intangible heritage. And then also this sense of place of where there's an emotional connection between individuals of and a specific location, landscapes, mountains, that kind of feeling of this area as a whole is important, not just an individual site. Which also helps add to integrating these with traditional conservation management gives us that more holistic approach. So when you're looking at an archaeological site or something, you're looking at it in its context of the environment around it and not just as an isolated site. And then so authenticity is another thing. I just wanted to touch on it. As I mentioned, authenticity historically had always been, especially in the Western world, connected with the material. Asian cultures, I will say, so in Japan and stuff, there's these temples that basically the authenticity of them is the method of building them, and they rebuild them every so many years. They try to reuse the material, but the reason they're important is because of their structure, not the like how old the wood is or anything. And it's part of that kind of how they're rebuilding them. That's what's actually important. That's what's significant to them. And then when I did my master's degree, we had one of our guest teachers was working on some of the restoration at the Taj Mahal, and they were using, traditional, like it was modern materials, but they're using the traditional methods of like hand cutting things. And that was how they were, that's what it was. It didn't matter that these are modern materials that they were buying from like a quarry or whatever. It was local workmen making these in the traditional methods. So it took like 20 times longer because they're carving out these tiny little things and then having to put them in. But that's what was important and that's what was authentic. And we see that a little bit more now in the US. So just to kind of touch on one of the big things I've kind of talked about throughout this is audiences and tourists. Obviously, visitors to archaeological sites are one of the biggest things, especially at larger sites. But we also have people like you guys who are just interested in these types of things and want to learn about them. And part of this is that, how do we interpret and present this kind of material to people? And how does that work within that kind of values-based management? I will say, so interpretation has often been looked at as kind of, on-site signage, or you get like a pamphlet when you go and visit somewhere. Conservation, maintenance, management decisions are all interpretive. And that's something that came out of when I was doing my research is if an area is closed off, people are going to think it's closed off for a reason. If an area is left neglected, they see that as a choice that the management has made to leave that area neglected. Um, at Pompeii and stuff, a lot of money, and again, so this is a management decision, goes to the elite houses, the big houses, the main stops on kind of the tour. The rest of the areas get neglected. That is an interpretive decision in the sense that the management is saying that this is more important and everything. So we say like interpretation as, mostly like an educational thing, but there's kind of this unintentional interpretation that we see at sites. And I think that also reflects into, land management. If people are thinking that we're neglecting things because we're not actively protecting it or something, they're going to think that, that's a choice that we're making. It's an interpretation. It's not necessarily always true. And that was kind of one of the things that I was looking at with my research was how are these decisions, how do they tie together with that management? And then, using this idea of interpretation of presentation, how can we engage people more and educate people more so that they're aware of why these decisions are being made, or why something is being presented in the way it was. And I mean, it's difficult. I'll be honest, nobody has the answer for it. But it is a way to engage the stakeholders with all of that. And the idea is to kind of create mindfulness. And this is kind of some of the stuff that I saw when I was working in Pompeii. And these are some of the quotes. So my research, I basically stalked people and interviewed them. I walked around behind people without them knowing, which sounds really creepy, but to see how they moved around the site, to see what decisions they made when they were walking, to see, did they seek out areas that were busy or less busy, and also what kind of things they were interested in. I also wanted to look at how people, interact with the sites. It's a big site. People get tired. They sit down on a wall, not thinking that this is an ancient wall and, that's potentially damaging a site. This poor kid up in this top right photo, he's been in so many of my presentations and things. I don't know who he is. He was just there. This is another thing, this is a broken gate that should be closed off because that area is not open to the public. But because the gate's knocked over, somebody's able to just wander in. And then there's also, what information's being shared there. Some of the stuff that came out is that, it's a very simple theme. It's one theme and it doesn't apply to everybody. So a lot of times there's kind of seen as, at sites, we don't want to engage people because we don't want them to be there. However, I would say it's actually better to educate them and let them know why we don't want people, maybe go walking in a certain place, let them kind of see what their impacts would be. One of the things I would say also with kind of using presentation, interpretation, visitor engagement, whatever you want to call it, is so it can help to mitigate the negative impacts by visitors by educating them. Most people are generally, well, okay. Most people are generally good. I know. But in general, like people who are at an archaeology site, like if you were to let them know that if you do that, it's bad, they're going to not do it. There's obviously going to be people who still will. I mean, some people are just like that, but it's that, educating them, but also, you could use on-site signage or barriers. So even if it's a site that's not open to the public, closing it off. We've done that with some of our stuff is, closing it off with a fence, but have some sort of interpretation there so that people understand why. People like the things that they, if they see something that's open like that and they want to explore, they'll do it. I'll be honest, I did it a couple times because I wanted to get photos of how things were in those areas, but I'm a professional. And honestly, one of the things I will say, there was one area I went into because I was like, I've never been back here. And I had like a pass, so I was allowed to like go into some of these things. And I went back there and I was like, there's a reason this is closed off. It's because it's dangerous. Like, um, but yeah, being able to have these tools to communicate the values and significance to the audiences is really, it means that we're going to have an increase of that meaningful collaboration between stakeholders. The public or visitors, I say visitors just because I was working at Pompeii, but I mean the public audiences are a stakeholder and they're a very important one. Like, honestly, we're not preserving or, you know, conserving or any of this stuff just for the fun of it. We're doing it because people are interested in it and because we've ascribed those values and significance to it. Like, if there wasn't that, if nobody cared about it, none of us would have any, we wouldn't be here. Because it's because we've ascribed those values to them and made them significant. Um, so a few things to touch on that I know I've mentioned some of the stuff that we're doing with at BLM with land management and things, but one of our big focuses is now what we're trying to do is not to look at sites as much in isolation, but to kind of emphasize that larger landscape. This is something that the tribes have tried to get us to do for years, and we're finally trying to do it. Couple of examples. So Browns Canyon National Monument, we had recently completed an ethnographic study with the Ute tribes out there. And what we're doing is taking that information from that study and integrating it into how we're going to be presenting the monument and managing it. So any kind of future projects that we have in there, but then updating signage and things like that. And it's looking at it on a landscape level, not individual sites within the monument. We're also doing a bit more proactive landscapes. And actually, that talk that you were saying at next month with Los Animas, I was like, that's right on here is a different thing. We haven't started it too much, but we're working in the process right now, is doing an ethnographic study and cultural landscape study of the Los Animas County. So, and that's because BLM manages the subsurface minerals. So we wanted to have this information so that as we're making decisions on leasing minerals and permitting mineral extraction, understanding how it impacts this cultural landscape that tons of tribes, like not even, I think that one we're up to like 5 or 6 tribes that we're working with on that one. That one's brand new. Like, we just got the funding for it at the end of last year. A lot of Bears Ears is a good example of kind of the co-stewardship. We don't have anything of that here. We've been kind of working on it, where it kind of lets the tribes and the agencies kind of steward these areas together. One thing, but BLM Colorado hasn't actually had any chance to implement any of those yet. But one of the great things that's come out with the Bears Ears co-stewardship is these guidelines for visiting with respect, that were the tribes helped to come up with these, and they were actually mostly probably their ideas. And these are things that we're starting to put into our signage, like for other places. So Browns Canyon will probably have some similar things like that. And then also bringing these audiences, these stakeholders, the tribes earlier on into the planning process, so that by the time we get to where we need to make a decision, we have the information to make the least impactful, in a least negatively impactful decision that we can. We've got a couple big projects. One of them's a reservoir development where we're actually having the company carry out an ethnography before we even start the process of analyzing it, because we want that information to be able to put into our analysis, because we know it's an important place to the tribes. So even though, like, technically how we manage things in the BLM is very different than what my kind of background experience is. It's been a strange journey I've lived. I still try to integrate that stuff into what I'm doing. For me, engaging people, engaging the different audiences and educating the public. Even if I'm out in the field doing a survey and some person asks me what I'm doing, I'm going to tell them. I might not tell them, hey, look, this is an archaeology site right here, but I want to educate them as to why I'm doing what I'm doing, which I think is really important. And I know some archaeologists won't agree with me on that, but for me, the education side of things is the more important. I think you can usually get a feel for people when you're in the field. Like if it's some like sketchy person up in like Penrose Commons, I'm not gonna maybe have that conversation. You can get a feel if it's somebody you want to back away from or whatever. And if it's somebody who I can tell is just interested in it, I want to talk to them about this kind of stuff and what we're doing and why we're doing it. However, okay, this is just a random coup from Scotland. He's not related to this, but he's super cute. And so I was like, I needed a picture for this last stitch. We still have these same challenges that we have had historically that we've seen through the history of every place ever. Increased development in tourism, there's a housing crisis. Everybody knows it. Like, why is everything so expensive? People are like, build more houses, but we're like, but that's our land. Well, not our land, but there's still all of these same problems. Um, Not to get political, but we do run into that there is zero consistency from administration to administration at the BLM. As a federal agency, what we were working on in November is very different than what our priorities are now. Like, that's just the nature of every 4 years or so, or whatever. Like, and it means that work doesn't happen during that time because we're still trying to figure out what new priorities are. And then money and people, um, are really hard to like, I will say like in the past like 3 or so years or 4 years that I've been with the BLM, I think our budget's gone down like 40% or something. And they're talking about more cuts this year. But it's not just federal government. I'm talking like everywhere. Things cost money. You don't see as many of these large scale excavations because those are expensive, unless you've got a bunch of grad students paying for them or undergrads, which it's just the way it is. And also resources. People, I will say, I don't know why, but it's really hard to recruit archaeologists these days. It seems like maybe people have we went through like a wave of the field being really popular, and we're kind of going through a lull. I don't know why. But it's something we've noticed with recruiting, like seasonals and interns, that there just isn't the interest that there used to be. I think it'll pick back up. Like, I mean, any kind of field will do that kind of thing. But those are challenges that we have, and they're gonna come, they're gonna go. You know, we do what we can with them. There's not a lot that we can do to change that kind of stuff. And I have no idea how long I was talking for. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes, it's more of a general comment that the last part here particularly brought to the forefront. And I worked several summers doing rescue archaeology and salvage archaeology, we used to call it, in Alaska, for DOT, Department of Transportation, state funds, but also matching funds from federal government. I know that this current administration will for sure probably cut most of that out in Alaska. My question is, and the same thing goes for some other things I've done under National Geographic, partial funding for the 11,000-year-old site that Fred and I worked on in Alaska. So my question is, are the days numbered? I think that a lot of archaeology will seem, so it appears to me, superfluous to the current administration, the way it appears. I'm hoping I'm wrong.
So I will say, from what I've seen currently, it's not archaeology that's going to be under fire. I'm obviously trying not to be super political on this, also because I still work for the feds. It's more environmental protections that we're starting to see things. So things that slow down, like the NEPA stuff, Environmental Protection Agency, things that kind of slow down oil and gas development and things like that. We haven't heard anything about archaeology. Haven't heard any rumors about like any of that kind of being overturned. By any means, that doesn't mean anything. I think, our field office, we do a lot of oil and gas anyways. So people are talking about how under this administration we'll have more oil and gas. That's never been something that our field office hasn't done because we manage all of the subsurface minerals in eastern Colorado. I do think there's going to be a change in priorities with some things. Just in terms of, okay, how much, I think it's gonna come down to the funding and how much money we have to actually do stuff. Like, we won't be getting funding for like special projects for archaeology, as much as we used to, from what I've heard. I will say, the new Secretary of the Interior, I don't know him. He just has only been in the job for about 2 days. 3 days. The tribes have really good things to say about him, which makes me cautiously optimistic. That's kind of been the story of my life, is cautiously optimistic since like, I don't know, the past year. So I think there might be some things that we're actually pleasantly surprised that kind of slide under the radar. But yeah, ask me again in a few months. Right now, I'll be honest, when it comes to like federal stuff, we are getting stuff on a daily thing that we're like, wait, what? Like, it's just like we keep getting just new things in because it's so new in the administration change. Oh, whoa, everybody.
Well, I'm listening, that how it occurs to me with this thing, and they're saying that oil and gas and all, but if they are stakeholders, especially in land management, they must be speaking up to some of these issues. Are they relying on some of the expertise that has been developed over the years through the Bureau of Land Management for them?
So are you talking like the stakeholders for the oil, like the oil and gas?
Oil and gas people are stakeholders.
They are. And I will say, we will probably see, in terms of priorities changing under this administration, that being told to make sure we're not slowing down oil and gas stuff. Honestly, I feel like we do it pretty regularly anyways, but they are stakeholders. The way we manage for oil and gas is also kind of weird because a lot of it's private surface. And they're just accessing federal minerals. I could do a whole nother talk on like federal minerals and directional drilling. You guys don't want that. So we have very limited stuff that we can do on that surface because it's private. And it's actually where the BLM's involved is like way down under the ground. Yeah, but we do have to consider, we get.
But those people are, what I'm trying to say is those people are also dependent on you.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, so basically, what we do with those is we get an application from a company. We have them hire an archaeology contractor to see if there's any sites in that area. And then usually if there is a site there, sometimes we'll talk with the companies and they'll be willing to move it, because a lot of them are big companies that have been doing this for years. Sometimes we'll have some sort of mitigation that we could do. So if the site's here, but they want to build the pad here, they're avoiding it. And then we give them the permit. And I mean, I will say, like, for oil and gas stuff, I think for archaeology, we've probably had about 15, 20 of them in the past 2 months. Like, it's a pretty regular thing. And it is something, I mean, we're obligated to respond to that application that they're submitting. Sometimes we have to say no, just based off of what's there. But in general, like, usually we're able to work out something. And that's part of that kind of stakeholder discussion is, we've got an arc site here. Can we shift the well pad a little bit so that we're not destroying that? And that's usually, or if it's a visual thing where, a view shed, they might put in some like shrubbery or something to kind of keep that view shed intact.
this is all very paradoxical to me. I come from a literature background, and
In 1815, before Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, it wasn't safe for English people to travel on the continent. They couldn't go to see all those ruins, so they traveled in their own country and wrote poetry about the ruined abbeys like Tintern Abbey.
Yeah.
But as soon as it was safe to travel, you really couldn't stop people from, taking a stagecoach to Istanbul or so. In a way, well, has not changed. It's just become real estate, I guess.
Yeah, when I was working in, or living in the UK, I do remember we'd go out to these, like Fountains Abbey and like Tintern Abbey, all of those, or you'd go to these huge estate houses, and then there'd be like a little Roman or Greek temple or whatever, and it's this thing where they would actually construct ruins to give them that ruin feel and take friends there. And it's like, oh, look at my, ruins. And it's actually like, a Greek temple and then, but they just built it like last week. It was a huge thing. It's kind of cool. It's the. Oh, nice.
Quick question, going back to Pompeii, what was the population when the eruption happened?
Oh, I should know that. I feel like it's like only a couple thousand. But I should know that. It's been a while since I've looked at that. I feel like. Let me get back to you on that one. That's going to be my answer because I'm trying to remember. So with the eruption, I will say, so there's kind of a misconception, and we talked about this a little bit at dinner, of people like being surprised with the eruption. And there's actually a lot of evidence that people left. So the amount of people that they found there it was much less than the actual population and there's evidence of people coming back between the lapilli and like the ashfall and finding like, they're not the bodies, but the hollow casts like in layers throughout it. So people had warnings, like it wasn't like everybody was just caught unaware.
Right. Yes, you're talking about preservation and conservation. Is the concept of photography, you never mentioned it, but is photography something that's a new tool because you can digitize images, and if nothing else, you have a museum with some fantastic images. It's not the same as going out and walking through the desert, but.
And I will say, that's not a new tool. It's been around. I guess I should have mentioned it at one point, but some of those early interpretations of houses in Pompeii they weren't photos at that time, but it was drawings. So, and that's also kind of where some of it was romanticized, but that was their way of kind of documenting it. I think photography is a great thing, because you can travel with it. You can also, especially now with the 3D stuff. I'm not a super techie person, but all the crazy 3D things. So for like structures, you can get them like basically almost where people can like walk through them at a museum. And it is a very good way to document something and preserve it outside of the field so that if it does need to either be destroyed because of something or it does get destroyed, you have that documentation. Yeah. Yeah.
You talked a bit about being Egypt. I wonder if you could say anything about the preservation of Abu Simbel.
I know, is that one down south that they had to remove?
Yes.
I did not get to go to that one. No.
It's very interesting.
I really wanted to. So when I went to Egypt, it was like the December after like Arab Spring. So probably wasn't the safest time to be going, but I wanted to go. But I will say I like in Egypt, one thing so when we were in Luxor, that was to me, I love Luxor, and the temples, but there's a lot of reconstruction there, a lot of it, but it really helps people see the size of things. And I notice it because I have the trained eye where I could be like, oh, you can tell where they filled this in. Again, there's no interpretation there about how this isn't what it was just standing for the past, however many thousands of years. Yeah.
So ruins were built by slave labor. Another interpretation of looking at,
Yeah,
but
and also a lot of the stuff's now in the British Museum. The British Museum, the only museum with nothing British in it. Actually, they do have a British section. Yeah, there's a few things. What is it? Is it the Sutton Hoo area? I think there's that there. And let me see what we've got online. Unless, is there any more questions in the room? Oh, 20,000. There we go.
That's coming from fun.
Yeah, there we go. 20,000. So about the same size as Canyon City. Yeah, that'll help me to remember it. I will say at Pompeii also. Oh, they all left. Oh. So at Pompeii, I mentioned earlier that there was like an earthquake like 10 years before. There's a lot of evidence that there was like repairs being done on houses at the time of the eruption, and like works, like houses were being remodeled and stuff. So they don't think that the town was fully like populated.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Browns Canyon,
Yeah.
I railroaded through there, probably 2,500, 3,000 trains both ways.
Nice.
Leading up 74 until traffic ceased in mid-97.
Mm-hmm.
All I recall of it is, railroad property. There's a branch up someplace that no longer existed by the time I worked there. It was the Rio Grande Southern Civic, which later became Union Civic. What is the status of that now? I guess it's become a national monument.
So-
I just thought it was ranch land and national forest.
It is a monument from like through the canyon bit. It's an Obama monument, so it was relative. I feel like, is that 2014, 13, 12? I don't know, I was overseas during those years. But basically from around the northern end is about Ruby Mountain area, maybe a little bit norther than that, and then the southern bit would be Hecla Junction.
Yes.
Is LM, the other side is Forest Service. We do still have we do still have grazing allotments that are in there, but not a lot of them actually. Sorry, actively graze within the monument just because of the topography. But all BLM land are open for grazing, under like FLIPMA and various other laws. So you.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, so it's, I mean, there's a few trails in there, but it's not a very heavily developed monument by any means. We just got dark sky certification, which I thought was kind of funny because I was like, there's no lights there. Easiest dark sky certification ever. And then the railroad going through it is preserved. Yeah, and I know they had talked about trying to redo it, but I think there's too many landowners at this point. But we've recorded it in most of the places. There's not a lot of like impacts, but we do keep an eye on it to make sure, but that's not really what people go there to vandalize by any means.
Is there anything of archaeological interest there other than what may have come with the railroad?
So Browns Canyon area is part of the Ute ancestral lands. So we do have a number of archaeology sites. There's also a huge connection with Mount Princeton, the hot springs. So kind of this different kind of view sheds and stuff. A lot of the stuff that's within Browns Canyon is going to be linked to kind of the wider, I call it the South Park cultural landscape, because we see the same sites or whatever. Currently for the BLM side, we have, I want to say it's like less than 10% of our portion of the monument is surveyed. So we have a lot of work to do for archaeology in there. We try to do a little bit more each year to kind of build onto that. And then the Forest Service does the same, and they have some sites on their side as well. It's pretty cool ones too. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited to do more like surveying there. We just haven't had much time. Again, people and money.
Was that iron ore mine in the Browns Canyon area or is it further off?
Which one is it?
There was an iron ore mine up there. Yeah.
The Calumet line. Calumet line was run by CFNI. Yeah,
It was north of Salida, I'm not sure how.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
it's north and east of Salida, and they supplied magnified ore to this field.
That's not in Browns Canyon.
Oh,
No,
that's right, I was like.
Yeah, I was like, I don't think so.
Hecla Junction, was there a mine up on top of that? I seem to recall it was.
There is.
By the time I.
One up there, I can't remember if it had a name or anything.
Three miles.
There's a couple of them. And honestly, when you're rafting now, you can see like tailings in places. I've yet to find a place in Colorado that has not been mined. They're everywhere. We just get a lot of. What was that? Well, yeah. One thing kind of interesting, so a lot of the chert for stone tools, lithic material comes from the Trout Creek quarry, which is along that northern bit of Browns Canyon on the Forest Service side. And it's a very distinctive chert. We actually see it, we started more to call it Trout Creek Light because we see it at multiple different quarries across South Park. But it's a very distinct one and it's been there forever, but that's where a lot of the materials come from. Anything else?
Yeah.